Hey everyone, and welcome to the Bridging Behaviors podcast, where we explore everything related to behavior, education, and how they work together to make a difference. Today's episode is about something that is often overlooked in the world of behavioral intervention, which is culture. How much do you think culture really shapes behavior? Simply put, the answer is a whole lot more than you think. Culture influences how we see the world, how we interact with others, and even how we define what is considered good and bad behavior. So sit tight because today we are diving deep into cross-cultural approaches to behavioral interventions. We'll take a look into perceptions, acceptance, implementation, and effectiveness of interventions across different cultures, based on research from all around the globe. And don't worry, if you're not familiar with these concepts, I'll break it all down as we move along so that it makes more sense. Before we jump into the main discussion, let's take a moment to define some of the key terms that we'll be using today, especially for those of you who may not be familiar with applied behavior analysis, which we commonly refer to as ABA. ABA is a scientific approach to understanding and modifying behaviors based on principles of learning. When we talk about behavioral interventions, we mean structured strategies used to encourage positive behaviors and reduce challenging ones. Reinforcement is a core ABA concept that refers to anything that increases the likelihood of a behavior happening again. It can be positive, such as adding something desirable, like a praise or a reward, or negative, such as removing something unpleasant, like turning off a loud noise. On the flip side, punishment refers to decreasing unwanted behavior, though it's important to note that ethical ABA practices prioritize reinforcement over punishment. Another term you'll hear is implementation, which simply means putting an intervention plan into action. Finally, when we talk about data collection in ABA, we mean systematically tracking behaviors to measure progress and effectiveness. Now that we've laid the groundwork, let's dive into how culture influences all of these concepts. So let's start by asking a simple question. How do you define inappropriate behavior? It seems like a simple question, right? But the answer actually depends on where you are, who you ask, and what cultural norms shape their perspective. Depending on where you are in the world, even down to the specific community, your answer can vary drastically. For example, in Australia, 2 researchers found that school principals' views on inclusion heavily depended on how they personally defined the word inclusion. Without a clear, culturally standard understanding, inclusion ended up looking more like integration, leaving some students' needs unmet. Similarly, another researcher and colleagues pointed out how teachers' cultural values influenced what they saw as problematic behavior in the classroom. In other words, what one teacher sees as misbehavior might actually be considered completely normal in another cultural context. In China, it was discovered that teachers' perceptions of disabilities evolved over time, from stigma to acceptance, partly due to cultural shifts in government support. These perceptions still heavily influence their approach to special education. So what does all of this mean for behavioral interventions? It means that if we don't take cultural values into account, we might completely misunderstand a behavior, or worse, implement an intervention that doesn't actually address the real issue. Essentially, it tells us that if we are not aware of how cultural values shape people's ideas of what's acceptable, we may entirely miss the mark when working with behavioral interventions. This is why understanding cultural perceptions is crucial in designing effective behavioral interventions. Now, even if you have the perfect behavioral intervention plan, it won't go far if it clashes with someone's cultural beliefs. Let's say you've designed what seems like the perfect behavioral intervention. It's backed by research, it's been tested, and it's proven to work. But what if the community you're introducing it to doesn't accept it? Researchers highlighted how cultural attitudes can lead to the rejection of certain behavioral strategies, especially when they're seen as inconsistent with core values. For instance, some interventions rely on direct praise, but in certain cultures, public praise can be uncomfortable or even embarrassing. Another interesting study looked at cultural events in Georgia, aimed at people with special needs. While these events had good intentions, they often lacked meaningful social interaction and weren't fully effective because they didn't align well with participants' real needs. In other words, good intentions aren't always enough. They need to align with cultural values to be truly effective. Ethical considerations are key here too. Ethical practices and behavioral interventions can't be just one size fits all. What's considered ethical in one culture, such as using rewards to encourage behavior, might feel manipulative or inappropriate in another. And then you've got studies showing that when interventions are culturally adapted, tweaking the delivery but keeping the core strategy, you're more likely to see long-term success. Rather than discarding interventions that don't seem to work in a particular setting, we should be asking, how can we adapt this to make it more culturally relevant? But let's say the intervention itself is sound and culturally acceptable. What stops it from actually being used? In the Navajo Nation, researchers found that traditional beliefs sometimes clashed with medicalized views of disability, creating behaviors to implementation. However, when those traditional beliefs were blended with contemporary views, it opened up new pathways for acceptance. On the practical side, another researcher highlighted how cultural competence among educators plays a huge role in whether interventions get off the ground. Think of cultural competence as a bridge. It connects the science behind behavioral interventions with the real-life experiences of the people they're meant to help. It makes sense because if you understand the cultural background of the individuals you're working with, you're better equipped to introduce interventions in a way that feels more natural and respectful. Interestingly, it was also found that some culturally appropriate interventions can be successfully implemented without changing their structure, just by being more aware of cultural dynamics in delivery. That means that sometimes small adjustments, like changing the way instructions are given or tweaking reinforcement methods, can be enough to make an intervention work within a specific cultural context. So now, let's talk data. Behavioral interventions thrive on data, but how reliable is that data across culture? We often assume that numbers don't lie, but when it comes to behavioral interventions, how we collect and interpret data can be deeply influenced by culture. Researchers studied Latin American families and found that quality of life is influenced by way more than material needs. It's about balancing emotional, social, and economic factors. This means that if we only measure success based on traditional Western standards, we might be missing the bigger picture. This balance is essential, but it also complicates how you measure success. Data collection has to account for cultural differences, or you risk misinterpreting results. For example, if we measure success only in terms of verbal communication, we might overlook progress in nonverbal communication, something that is highly valued in certain cultures. And as another researcher pointed out, generalizing data from one culture to another can be tricky as well. Sometimes that's effective in one place may not translate at all somewhere else. That's why it is important to continue research into culturally sensitive interventions instead of assuming a one-size-fits-all approach works everywhere. If we want interventions to work globally, we need to be constantly refining our approaches rather than assuming a one-size-fits-all model. To wrap things up, it's very clear that culture plays a huge role in shaping how we see behavior and how we approach interventions. What one culture considers bad behavior might be totally acceptable in another, which means we can't just apply the same methods everywhere. A one-size-fits-all approach doesn't cut it. Small differences, like changing how we reinforce behaviors or adjusting our communication style, can make a big difference in making interventions more effective and culturally appropriate. When it comes to measuring success, we need to think beyond just numbers or verbal communication. Different cultures value different things, and our data collection should reflect that. A lot of research still focuses on Western standards, so we need more studies that take diverse cultural backgrounds into account and look at the long-term impact of these interventions. For me, this conversation reminds me how important it is to continue learning about cultural differences and to approach each situation with respect and flexibility. Moving forward, I want to focus on how we can bring more cultural awareness into behavioral training and intervention designs. Ultimately, the goal is to make sure these strategies work not just in theory, but in practice across a wide range of cultures. Thank you so much for listening.